Hello, everybody watching out there. I'm Melanie Reinhart, and I'm now going to be in conversation with Marilena. I've been a professional astrologer since 1975, and I first connected with astrology in my life in 1959. So doing the maths, that's 59 years coming up. And that blows my mind when I think about it, but that is what happened. I found a small book in a local library when I was off school, and so not in class, but wandering around, pleasing my own intellectual curiosity. I found this small book on astrology, and I still can remember the moment when I opened it and began to read. And my first response was one of a kind of amazement and indignation, because I absolutely knew somehow that there was way more to astrology than what was written in this little book. And that just kick-started what has become a lifetime of, I guess, indulging that curiosity about astrology.
What happened after that? Did you receive formal training, or did you learn by yourself?
Well, both, actually. Because I was born in what was then Rhodesia, it's now Zimbabwe, and we were kind of building up to war situation with lots of sanctions and hardships and all the rest. Yeah. It was also very much an agrarian kind of economy, not an intellectual environment at all. So there really was no milieu with classes and libraries and books and other people doing stuff like that in esoteric studies. And so it was kind of me on my own with this little book I borrowed. So I learned about the sun signs, and then I literally, from age 10 on up for years and years, I just asked everybody I met when they were born. And I observed and I looked and I asked questions, and I tried to see how it matched up with what I'd read and so on. And then about 8 years after that, when I was in Cape Town at university, a friend gave me a copy of Dane Rudhyar's book called The Pulse of Life, which I still think is this is an essential reading in terms of astrology. And I still think it's one of the greatest astrology books ever written. And it certainly, it was like an epiphany for me. That I remember also. I remember receiving this gift. It was a birthday present from a friend, and opening it up, and of course reading my own sun sign, which is Gemini. And I was absolutely astonished. What I read made me feel as if this person, who at that point I had never met, knew me better than my own parents did, maybe even better than I did. It was so, so profound. And in that moment, I knew that I wanted to follow where astrology would lead me somehow, you know? So there were like stages of commitment to it. But still, there was no milieu that I found, and no, esoteric bookshops or anything like that. And so the wish to immerse myself more deeply was one of the reasons I left Africa and came to London. And I spent quite a few years living in a spiritual community. And I think this is such an amazing coincidence, because it turned out that the man who was focalizing the community, well, he only turned out to be the then publisher of Dane Rudhyar's works. In fact, that company was the first major publishing company to take Rudhyar's work seriously. Amazing. And so an entire library of all of Rudhyar's works was there in the community library. So my beginnings were first through just very basic observation of people. Oh, and my father knew quite a lot about the sky, and I still remember him. We were out at night, and he would be pointing out the constellations to me. So yes, then years of just observation and being curious, and then a kind of in-depth immersion in the work of Dane Rudhyar. I have read pretty much everything that he's written that was easily available at that time. And so just year by year, I studied Rudhyar. I learned how to calculate charts, so I then went on to actually studying a full chart, not just looking at sun signs. And, you know, I just followed the thread, and one thing led to another. And so I went from zero up to being able to work professionally without ever having attended a class or had a teacher. And then came the point, it was not so long before my Saturn return, so I already knew enough to know what that meant. And I do have Saturn in the 10th house, and I thought, well, you know, if I'm going to dedicate myself to really learning this stuff deeply, then I really need some proper training. Because I knew, left to my own devices, there was all kinds of things I would never bother with. And that I felt, you know, to round out my astrological education, that was important to me. And so I signed up for the faculty course, which I did up to diploma level. And certainly never regretted that for one moment, you know. So it was a combination, but I think maybe, so my own Mercury is retrograde, so I did everything backwards. So I did everything on my own first, even up to professional level. And then I began to take courses and study, which I still do, you know.
Yeah.
I still do training courses, you know, not just random one-off things, but proper training courses. And I think it's so fabulous the way that opportunity is there in our field. I mean, you can study really high quality stuff all your life if you want to, which is kind of what I've been doing. I'm glad that I learned in the sequence I described, because I learned first through intuition and sensation and feeling and experience and observation.
All right.
And I don't know how I would have coped with all of the learning if I had come in at the intellectual and theoretical level. I think I'd have probably just got overwhelmed, you know. But I did it the other way around, and I'm glad to have that background, you know.
So when did you start seeing clients professionally?
I saw my very first paid-for client in the autumn of 1975. I had been reading charts on a non-paying basis for many years before that.
Okay.
Probably hundreds, you know. But the watershed of the first paying client, that was 1975. And very interestingly for me, that was, I think it could have been the very same month, but within about 4 weeks of actually attending a workshop given by Dane Rudhyar. That was like my total dream come true, because I'd been reading all of his stuff, but in isolation for so many years. And I actually attended a workshop. It was wonderful. I did. I met him. I met him.
Fantastic.
And he was very kind and very encouraging to me. And within that same month, I had the courage to do my first piece of professional work.
Excellent. What do clients typically come to you for? Is there a theme, types of life challenges or particular types of questions they have? Or
yeah, I think there's a broad variety of people with a broad variety of needs. But, you know, over the years, I guess because, again, I've sort of ended up sort of specializing in the work with Chiron and the Centaurs. Now, the strange thing is, I do get a really high proportion of clients where Chiron and sometimes the other centaurs as well really sing in the horoscope. I mean, it is unmistakable. You're falling all over the symbolism of it. Incredible. But not all of them have come to me because they know that I wrote a book on Chiron. Many of them have never even heard of Chiron. They have no idea I wrote a book. They don't know anything about that. But somehow they come to me, and I can see that some of the themes that they're bringing are very precisely symbolized by the movement and the meaning of Chiron and the Centaurs. Now, of course, you know, they could go to a different astrologer who didn't use those and have a perfectly good reading. So I'm not saying that it's essential that you have to use this stuff. But what I notice is that by one strange means or another, that's a big chunk of the clients that I attract are people where this stuff really sings in their chart. So that will typically be people who are committed in their own way to some kind of path of awakening. And you know that nice little phrase, a path of awakening. Well, we all know what that means. It could throw one in the deep end of the psyche. And one does end up encountering some very poignant and potent internal material. Some of it's on the psychological level, but it also goes beyond that into the ancestral realm, for example, into other dimensions of space and time. So when you get to the weird stuff, Chiron and the Centaurs do provide signification for the kinds of experiences that are not really signified as clearly in the rest of the planetary pantheon, at least in terms of the detail, you know, the transits and when things happen and all kinds of connections. That, of course, I find incredibly interesting because it's that which has also provided the raw material which I ended up writing about. So all of it was taken from actual hands-on work. So those are people who have either chosen to jump in the deep end of their process or have been flung in by life circumstance, including illness. So that's a big one, you know. And then there's a whole selection of I guess the usual common themes. People ask about location, so I do astrocartography if that's needed. Occasionally, either in the email or phone exchange when we're setting up the appointment, or in the middle of a session, occasionally somebody will pop a question that I hear as a horary question.
Right.
And I did do training with both Jeffrey Cornelius and Deborah Holding.
Okay.
Over quite a long period. In fact, I trained with Jeffrey. It was 1989, 90. And then I did Deborah's practitioner certificate in 2012. And so sometimes people are surprised that I would use such a traditional technique, you know, and I also do all this weird stuff. But that, to me, that's just kind of normal, you know. And so I guess in astrology, I'm always looking for the tool, quote unquote, the tool or the approach that best fits whatever the person is bringing, you know? And I suppose I feel that astrology has so much of a potential to truly enlighten us about things. And I don't mean any kind of grandiose final enlightenment or anything, but to shed light, you know, like you waving your hands and the light comes on. I think maybe that's what astrology is like. We sit down here and we look at charts and we talk to each other and we wave our hands to the skies and boom, the light comes on. Yeah. That's what it's like, you know. And I really think that if one has that view, that it really influences what you do with your astrology. So that means what kind of work you do or don't take on, how you speak to the people that you speak to, what aspects of your craft you engage with as you work with somebody, etc. So if the agenda is to try to avail oneself of the process of the light coming on, well, then you're going to avoid all kinds of fear speak. And, you know, there are still plenty of books around, some, you know, from way back, and even some more contemporary ones, that do occasionally fall into that kind of fear speak, which comes from a very binary or dualistic way of thinking, which Dane Rudhyar, to my knowledge, he was really one of the very first astrologers to spell it out, that we are moving into a different kind of worldview. And I don't mean globalism or anything political whatsoever, but there is a new worldview, a new cosmology that is partly being occasioned by the discovery of the new physics, but it's also a kind of general process of awakening beyond the narrow confines of the duality that I think for a long time kept astrology trapped in notions of right, wrong, correct, incorrect, good, bad, and so forth. Now, it's not that that way of thinking has no place, but it's a question of discernment, I think. So, you know, there are certain kinds of horary questions where you need the capacity to think in terms of, okay, yeah, this is favorable and this isn't. And this is, you know, you need to be able to chunk it right down and think in that way. But the moment you start trying to apply that kind of thinking to the psyche, wow, that can get pretty toxic. So to me, part of what it is to, you know, to go more and more deeply into astrology is to try to exercise that kind of discernment. It's like, well, what's the purpose of what I'm doing? What's the right tool for the job in terms of, you know, here and now, this person, me, etc. And how might one widen the framework or open the windows, open the doors, kind of thing. I've strayed way off your question.
No, that's great.
Sorry.
Great. I love it. Please continue doing that.
All right.
So, where do you see astrology going?
Ooh, that's a big one. Well, firstly, I think that I'm not sure what the word astrology actually means in the context of what you're asking, and so I'm not just being tricky there, but there are so many different astrologies, let's say. So what I would like to see is the permission, because actually it's obvious, the permission, and that's just inside all of our own heads, to discern clearly, what is the purpose of what I'm doing with my astrology? Is it research? And if it's research, is it scholarly research? And if so, for what? If it's statistical research, for what? Reading horoscopes, for what? It's all to do with why we're doing it. And there's layer on layer of that, which I think is really important. So that's a close cousin of maybe the discernment about what's the best tool for the job. And there, I think, gosh, we have such an incredible toolkit. We really, really do. And, everybody can't be an expert at everything. Maybe once upon a time when the field was a lot less developed, that was still possible, but it's not possible now. And of course, the correlate of that is the all too human tendency of having to prove that you're right. Now, to me, that is a major shadow element in the field of astrology. And I don't think it has to be, because in truth, there's room for it all. There are as many different kinds of astrologers as there are different kinds of people doing it, actually. And amazing to think that the field is so big that people with very different kinds of temperaments, very different kind of background, different specific kind of intelligence that they have or don't have, that there's room for all of it in there, and we can all learn from each other. I mean, it is amazing. So I feel that as professionals, as well as, so when I say professionals, what I mean is people who are reading charts, teaching and writing. But there's a huge body of people who don't really do any of the above to any degree, but they are total lovers of astrology. So the word amateur comes from the word meaning to love. Yes. So to me, it's the lovers of astrology. So lovers of astrology are the ones that can hold that paradigm of it's all okay. It isn't the case that somebody has to be right and somebody has to be wrong. We do all need to challenge each other about discernment, for sure. But that's a whole different thing. That's not about right and wrong and who's got, who's got the way, the truth and the light, etc. Because that only leads to division, and it's not necessary. One of the most inspiring things for me about the zodiac, or the ecliptic and the zodiac constellations, I can't remember when this was, but there was a moment when I suddenly realized, oh my God, these are the constellations that everybody on the whole earth sees at one time or another. So there are plenty of constellations which are high up enough above or below the ecliptic so that huge swathes of people on the planet never get to see those constellations. But our great zodiac wheel, it really is a symbol of the journey of every man and his or her soul, and in that sense there's room for everybody. So what I feel is that two things is that the field, of course, will get wider and broader, and with the speed of communication and the internet and different kind of media and things like that, that will also continue. And what will happen is that there will be a sacrifice of depth for breadth. That is inevitable. It always happens. Now, that's where the lovers of astrology come in, because it's our job to hold the depth. Anybody who is a lover of astrology, whether they're professional or not, someone who's like connected with it in their heart and soul, they are the ones who hold that inner connection and who know from personal experience what this stuff is about, who have gone way deeper than the intellectual curiosity level into experiences with and in astrology that are total moments of wonder and awe. Because really, in my way of thinking, that's where it leads. Like if you really, really study, and you really, really even study a chart or study something about astrology, if you really, really think properly and feel properly, where you're going to go is like, puff, oh my God, this is absolutely a thing of wonder. So one will never be able to understand it all intellectually or at that level of the curious mind, which of course can feel frustrating. Particularly in the beginning, people learn because they want to learn it all. And then gradually over time they realize, well, you can't actually. And anyway, that's not the point. The point is almost like, you know, in the Zen tradition, they work with these conundrums or questions or statements called koans. And they're contemplative devices that when those are working as they should, leads to a kind of opening into a whole other level of consciousness. And in that tradition, as I understand it, typically then the disciple will have to go and report to the master the big aha that he's just had. And typically the master will, you know, maybe sometimes even with a stick, send him back to the cushion and tell him that he's deluded and he hasn't understood anything. Okay. So to me, astrology is like a succession of those kind of moments when the mind opens to something that you could spend the rest of your life trying to describe or explain or whatever. And some people do. But I think, for me anyway, the point is that moment of wonder. It's like, ah, wow, you know, we all live in the same cosmos. We all see the same constellations. We see the same sun and the same moon. And we participate in this absolute magical mystery. And the energy of that is actually, it's phenomenal, you know? And so to me, that's where all the study and the knowledge and everything of astrology, that's where it's trying to lead us. To that moment of, oh, wow, like that very famous etching by Flammarion, who was 19th century. Well, he wrote a magazine. He wrote a kind of weather report thing, but it's so. This famous etching. It's like there's a shepherd in a field, and it's like he stuck his head through the firmament. And he's seeing all the kind of wheels and the mechanisms of how the universe works. So below is this very charming pastoral scene. And then the shepherd, oh my God, he's looking at the heavens. And he's connecting the two, you know, as above, so below.
Yeah.
And to me, that's really like the depth of what astrology is about. It operates at a level so much deeper than our ego concerns or personality or any of that. It really is about our participation in this great mystery of life. And I think that, I know from my own experience with consulting that somewhere holding that perspective in one's heart or in the back of one's mind, then it does inform how you describe what it is you see. on the chart. And there's no doubt in my mind about the value, and I'm even going to say the healing potential of giving people permission to get back in touch with that feeling of communion, participation, belonging.